Sometimes I just want to like pat this computer and be like, it's okay, you can do it. Like, I'm not even joking. It took this thing a full like 6-7 minutes to actually just start up. So you can do it, computer. Okay. All right, so just kind of keeping an eye on our schedule for things. We'll either finish up or come close to finishing talking about digital literacy today, although obviously that will be incorporated throughout the rest of the semester as well because it's so important. On Friday, we're going to start thinking critically about science in particular. As much as we want to be scientifically based, we also need to fully acknowledge the existing biases within science. And then a week from today, I will pass out exam 1. So you do need to be in class to pick up your copy, and then you'll have until the following Wednesday to turn it in. Something that I will put on your radar next week as well, but a week from Monday, we're actually going to do a library information session and talk about how to use good sources. So I'll keep that on your radar because we will change the location for that. But today, Friday, next Monday, next Wednesday, next Friday, we're in here. All righty. So, let me go ahead and turn on our captions because these do closed captions for me on YouTube as well, which is great. Okay, and we had left off on this slide here, which we were talking about various types of literacy within the digital literacy. So one of the things we had just mentioned is that's really easy to reproduce and redistribute digital information now. I mean, obviously this isn't new. I put up the Andy Warhol pictures right as an example of that. People have been producing and reproducing things for years. And in fact, depending on the school wherein you learn fine arts, they might start by having you just reproduce plaster. There's a really good documentary I want to say on Netflix about these forgeries that were sold, and like they were so convincing that experts were like, oh yeah, they're real, wow. And it was just like a guy who, that's how he'd been taught art, was to copy the masters. And so he was able to extrapolate from that and create quote unquote new works by these folks, undiscovered works. So what are the pros of having everything so easily accessible online? I mean, literally in the palm of our hand or around our wrists, right? Like, I feel like I don't even know if you're gonna get this reference, but it was a character called Dick Tracy who dropped into his watch, and that was like very sci-fi. Definitely feel like Dick Tracy sometimes with my smartwatch. But what are the pros of having access to all this information so quickly? Yeah, Taylor. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I'm laughing because I'm remembering there was one time we went on like a weekend away with several friends, and we had a lovely Airbnb, but it was out in the mountains and it was in a valley and it had no Wi-Fi. So you had 6 millennials without access to be able to look up information on their phones, and it drove us a little bonkers all weekend. Some people found it liberating. I was like, no, I want to know. But yeah, I mean, you have a question, you can look it up. If you are not sure about something, you can refute that pretty quickly, right? Yeah, what are some other advantages of having so much information freely and quickly available to us right now? Yeah.
The last three years we did one by here.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, right? We joke about going down rabbit holes on Wikipedia or YouTube, right? But like that allows us to see those connections so quickly that sometimes we are really trying to show you in liberal arts education, right? That you can find some things more quickly. Anything else? Or do y'all just like hate living in a digital world?
Also, when we wouldn't be able to get our evidence. Without actually like, last minutes and like.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point that we can quickly get important health or news related information and ensure that we're other people really quickly too, right? So I think about, let's take, I'm from the Midwest, so snow days are much more common. Let's take a snow day. When I was in high school, I went to a private high school. And so they didn't always list us on the news. So we had a phone tree, I'm joking, where we would call each other's landlines and be like, no school today, right? And yeah, it worked, but it was very inefficient, right? Today, I'm sure they just like send out a push notification, like a live safe or something like that, right? Yeah, so you can get information quickly. What are the cons to that? Or just having all this information readily accessible, what are the bad parts? Yeah, and children can access information they might not understand or be ready to know about, right? Yeah.
Desensitization, some of them or other sensitive things. So casually and so often, I'm not gonna take it for what it is.
I think that's such a good point, because even like our movie rating system is really different for violence than it is for like sexual acts, right? Yeah, I think there's a big piece of that. And then that translates over sometimes into the real world, quote unquote. I mean, it's obviously not the only thing that influenced them, but the Columbine shooters were huge RPG video game players and kind of executed their shooting as if they were in a video game, right? So not for everyone, but for some people, you can get sort of that desensitization, feel like it's not real, right? Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, no.
Which is so much. Almost too much.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming, right? Especially when you're getting push notifications and texts and alerts, right? During the early days of the pandemic, I actually had to turn off news alerts on my phone because I didn't be in the middle of teaching, right, remotely from my couch. And I'd get an alert that like X number of people have died of it. And like, if it take me out of myself, I wouldn't be able to focus. And so I was still looking at the news. I just had to turn that off so that I could focus, right? Yeah, it can be overwhelming. And sometimes we don't even know how to process it. And I think kind of similar to what Elijah was just saying, it can desensitize us in the same way, right? I mentioned like, we haven't reckoned with how many people have died because it's just sort of this abstract number, right? And so I think that can be overwhelming. Yeah, great examples, other cons of stuff just being out there. Yeah.
I think less diversity of idea. When I say that, I don't mean like people don't have more ideas than they did like a while ago. Obviously they would, but I think like this incubates more extremist beliefs. So if you have an idea that's not necessarily a part of either extreme on any subject, then it's harder to get your point across because you know put into your extreme.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Did I tell you guys about the Twitter bot that became a Nazi within a day? Yeah, right. So like, just by looking at what people were tweeting about, yeah, it's the loudest, most extreme voices get heard and retweeted and things along those lines, right? And so you can end up in these echo chambers where you can end up thinking a lot more people feel this way than they do because those are the loudest voices. One example is they recently did like basically contact tracing, but for information, and found that pretty much all the impetus for the book bans around the country are coming from like, I think it's 6 Twitter accounts. Or like those people reaching out to the specific school districts and things like that. So that means there's probably a lot of people who don't care, right? Or wouldn't care as much, wouldn't make as a big deal of it, and yet those voices are being pushed because they're allowed it. Yeah. What about related to some of the stuff we've been talking about in terms of maybe not the correct information or misinterpretation? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Media sources will tell you anything, because they're trying to stand into it. They'll go to the
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I don't know if anyone else listens to local radio, but when I got my kiddo off, I listened to Mike and Bosom in the morning. And one of the things they were talking about this morning was Joe Jonas's divorce. And just like the narrative that's being created about it, like, oh, his wife is partying too much and he's not. It's like, who's defining what too much is, right? And things along that, like, who's skewing the narrative? Who is putting information out there? Whose PR team is better? It's a lot of what comes out of this day and age. And people even embracing that. I think of it's sort of on both sides of the political spectrum right now. Joe Biden embracing the Dark Brandon thing. I don't know if people have seen that, but he's like leaning into it. And then Trump getting t-shirts printed with his mugshot on them. Right? It's like a little absurd in some ways that like these are the people who are like, one just ran our country for 4 years and one is currently running our country, that it's like, well, if that's what you gotta do, but also like, where's the gravity of the office, right? I don't know, I'm not like a prissy stuck up person, but it just feels weird to me, right? Even things like, as much as I loved it and laughed at the time, like Hillary Clinton, when she was a presidential candidate, tweeting at Donald Trump to delete his account, right? Like if it's snarky, but it's also like, okay, but what about freedom of speech? And what about this? And what about that, right? It's so easy to make like a quick comeback. I was reading a thread last night on Twitter. I'm always going to call it Twitter, about birth plans and safe procedures within birthing process. And this is something that's really important to me because I had a birth where a lot of stuff that could go wrong did go wrong, but my ultimate birth plan was served, which is myself and the baby lived. That was really my whole birth plan, to be perfectly honest. And there was a NICU nurse who said, you know, seeing people refuse things like the vitamin K shot, which can prevent brain-based bleeding and save infants' lives, or even just like a stick to check for certain diseases that can be treated right away, makes her really sad and scared because she's a NICU nurse and she's seen the consequences of it. And someone just tweeted back, well, you're a bad nurse. And it's like, it's so easy to knee-jerk and say stuff like that, but like, you don't know her. It sounds like she's actually a very concerned, empathetic nurse, right? But it's so easy to fire these things off, right? And not have a lot of thought. Yeah, the one thing that I think is good, that at least Twitter has done, I'm not sure other things have, like, I don't believe this has happened to me on Facebook, but maybe I just haven't missed it, is if you go to share an article, but you haven't clicked on it, it'll pop up and be like, do you want to read this first? Right? And that seems so silly, but so many people just are like, yup, echo chamber, yup, I'll just retweet it, right? And so you need to kind of be aware of that. Yeah, so having all this information at our fingertips is great, but it also creates more of a challenge for us as psychology students, not only to make sure the information is accurate that we're receiving and maybe repeating, but also to challenge ourselves to have empathy in a space where that's not necessarily the norm, right? So, got an example link here. Don't know if folks have seen this before. This is true. What's your initial gut reaction? You've seen it before. So how many people have seen this before or something about this? Okay, a couple. Yeah. What do you think of the idea that our president, our current president, Dr. Miller, has a history of plagiarism? hypocritical, problematic, so if you don't know this whole story, I'm not gonna read it, but basically he like copied, pasted a speech from somebody else and passed it off as his own. And it's pretty rare to get one of these, a vote of no confidence from the faculty at one of the colleges he was at. Which basically means the faculty says, we don't trust you to run the university. It's very rare for faculty to do that. I think it failed by one vote, but he still left. So yeah, he's had accusations a couple times, passed off other people's work, right? And we still hired him knowing this. And people who are on the search team, who I very much respect, faculty, were like, oh, well, you know what, he had a good explanation for it, and we think it's great, and he's gonna be really great for us, and, you know, there are good things he kept going. I want to fully acknowledge there are ways that the university has benefited from some of the things he's done. But, I mean, thinking about our honor code and thinking about, you know, the expectations we put on y'all, how do y'all feel knowing, again, as Naya said, there's hypocrisy. I want to do like part I in it. So it was lovely. I love that. And I feel like this is actually something I've really noticed with like the past couple of years of students I've been interacting with, is you all have a lot of like, give people space to breathe and grow. And I love that. I think that that's really going to benefit going forward. I was gonna say, I didn't do that. I also understand that something, it's not black and white, but we understand that something wrong. And for the reason it's on, at least not really to be telling you why it's something wrong. But if you can't say that, I don't know what. But it's like, yeah, and that's such a good point. It is so important to surround yourself with people who won't just echo you, right? And who will fact check you. And even something as like, before I submit like a grant proposal, especially if I'm working independently, and I don't have collaborators on it with me, I have my husband read it over. He knows what I've told him about psychology for the many, many years we've been together. We're actually going to go 20 years together, which is mind boggling. But he doesn't know the intricacies of psych, but he can look at it and be like, this doesn't make sense, right? Should you be citing here? You have a typo. So surrounding yourself with people who will tell you that stuff and not be afraid to.
The other thing is, we can have the difference that we see my eyes, what the is, I think that's a very big distinction. That speech as
Right.
So,
Who was it? Someone recently came out that they had plagiarized their PhD thesis. I don't remember who it was, but some big name.
yeah, so in my eyes, it's like, okay, well, it's a speech, or it was a non-creation speech, or they were, you know, a lot of people's cultures, that it's for a lot of people. What it comes down to is it really something that's very academic. And it is, it's really setting social for person, it's not really something academic, there's more something inside function.
Yeah, and I think like borrowing from other people is totally fine. He could have fixed this whole thing by just being like, I was inspired by so and so at the start of his speech, right? And actually, to be perfectly honest, that is the most common like plagiarism thing I see from students, and I will usually just sort of take a few points rather than giving a 0, is like people who just don't cite. If you write a whole paper without citations, and it's not like the sky is blue, I'm wearing yellow, the obvious things, right? Then that's plagiarism, but a lot of people don't necessarily recognize that. So yeah, educating and learning and attributing your sources.
I'm gonna agree with the latter half, second, I would set a bad precedent just because. I don't know, I don't know what being the president of the university entails. I don't know what he does, but I mean, just having that be there and be an article, it's just not good for garnering public opinion. And also, his school's had not the best history with higher faculty members and their opinions, and well, they couldn't even discuss. I think just something so it doesn't set the best precedent for bringing people in to work, bringing people in to fix and stuff like that. So, but again, I don't have too strong an opinion on it. Like I said, I don't know what it does. So.
Yeah, that's a good question too, like. What do people do? My understanding is a vast majority of his job, or at least a big chunk of it, is trying to raise money for the school. But then does oversee certain day-to-day operations as well, but yeah, like. We don't even know what people do because of all these smoke and mirrors, right? Whether or not you like Chick-fil-A or call it hate chicken. There was a funny parody song a few years ago where a guy sang a song about how he has no idea what Dan Cathy, the head of Chick-fil-A, does, right? And it's just sort of like, yeah, like what do CEOs do? What do these people do, right? And those are things that are important to know. I kind of got at some of these things, yeah, sharing memes. You know, one of the things I've seen a lot, which is really interesting, being controversial on the internet, is people who share someone else's stuff without attribution. So like they'll take a screenshot of what someone said and post it on Instagram, but won't tag the original poster. And so some people have a real problem with that. Or like comedians taking each other's jokes, things like that. So it is a sort of a tricky world, right? Where we're trying to navigate. And also like, how do you prove who had the idea first? If it's something like a joke, right? Alrighty. So then we're going to talk about branching literacy. So something as simple as like page numbering in a you know, journal article or something along those lines, means that we can go back and cross-check their sources. So why is it important to be able to go back and like check the original source material? I mean, there's a whole host of reasons why, right? One is sometimes we just want to go back because we're curious. We're like, oh, what did they say? Sometimes you could take somebody way out of context, right? By just quoting one little thing. And sometimes you get a whole idea from like one footnote and that perpetuates. So give you guys an example. Hopefully this won't make anybody uncomfortable, but there is this myth that the vibrator was invented to treat hysteria because they used to help women who have hysteria, which is sort of like nervousness, a whole host of things, by giving them orgasms. And that idea came from like one footnote somewhere, and then someone wrote like a whole book about it. And in fact, recent historical work is saying not quite. It was like eventually used for that, but that's not why it was originally developed, right? So it's a small thing, but that myth got perpetuated to the fact that there was a movie maybe 10 years ago called Hysteria, all about that, right? Hypermedia. So freedom in examining different disciplines of knowledge, right? So people really like this in textbook now, like all the textbook publishers, they like solicit us. They're like, don't you want to use our book for blah, 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 blah. And they're all like, look, we embed videos, and we embed pictures, and we embed hyperlinks. Okay, so that's awesome that you can get more information, but what are the disadvantages of having all that? Whereas before you might have just had like sort of text on the page with a couple of pictures. Yeah. Yeah, that it can be completely overwhelming. You can get distracted by it. People who might have like attention issues, that can be really hard for them to focus on what they're supposed to be getting out of it. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I used to be the worst highlighter ever. I would basically highlight like the whole book, right? I'm like, that's not helpful. over the years, I've trained myself to find the important information and only highlight that. But yeah, it can be really hard to tell what are these things here. And Daryl is saying, I think that it's a disadvantage because not everything from the text will be told in the video or the picture. So sometimes there's a lack of information. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. It does give us a better sense of like multidimensional spatial orientation, which is a fancy way of saying we can sort of figure out connections to things, imagine them in our head, work with that information, and that's an important skill to have, particularly in our digital media heavy world. Information literacy is something that is not unique to digital literacy. It's always been vital to successful learning, but it's a survival skill in the digital era, and I think we've already touched on why, right? You need to be able to look at something and say, is this a credible source? Does this make sense, right? Where can I go for information to see whether this is correct or not, right? And so that's really important. Again, in the digital world where anyone could put anything up, even something like Wikipedia, which a lot of people see now as like a trusted source, technically anyone can get an account and edit that. It's been changed now, but one of my friends from grad school had edited something about like a type of depression and called himself like Moore the Great, Dr. Moore the Great, right? And that was up there for years, right? And so that's kind of a silly example, but it also means that even sources like that, we can't always necessarily trust. All right, so you had a reading about AI, and we're gonna look at some of the AI stuff. So before I like start talking about it at the start of the semester in my syllabus and whatnot, how many of you have heard of ChatGPT? Okay, most of you, cool. Because one of the things we're worried about is a little bit like the DARE program. Like, are we just teaching them how to use it? We talk about it, right? So good, yeah. So a lot of people are familiar with it. So what is this type of AI? What does it allow you to do?
It let me, write essays. They were supposed to be read.
Yeah. There's all, yeah, essays are what I think professors are most worried about, people doing, because it's not as easy. You can't run this through Safe Assign, because if you ask it the same question multiple times, it'll write something slightly different each time. But there are a host of things that can help you do that can actually be helpful, right? And so I don't have GPT-4, I have the 3rd edition because the GPT-4 you have to pay for, and I'm cheap. So let's be honest. I'm pretty sure I made my account with my VWU email. Yep. All right, so if you haven't played with ChatGPT yet, you have this prompt down here, and you can ask it to do anything. And it was really interesting. We had 2 different workshops at the start of the semester. 2 different experts came in and sort of taught faculty about how to use it in creative ways in the classroom. And so like one of the things you can do is like set it up to quiz yourself. You can ask it to help you write prompts for essays if you're bad at doing that. I did a workshop last January about it, and you can actually ask ChatGPT to create a lesson plan for you. So let's say create a lesson plan for a 50-minute college psychology course focusing on digital literacy. Helps if you spell right. So it will think, and for GPT, I guess they're calling it 3.5 now. It depends on how many people are on. Like I remember when I first got my account, everybody was on it at the same time. So it would take like 20 minutes for stuff to come back. But it will like write out a lesson plan with prompts and assignments and things along those lines for you. And it's very slowly doing it. There we go. There we go. It's starting now. It had to think a little bit. There we go, digital literacy and psychology. What was the name of the course? You know, give you objectives, so like, this is what you guys should learn. I mean, I haven't actually used this to create a lesson plan, but certainly if I was a new teacher, I'd probably use the heck out of this, right? Because when you first start teaching, whether it's at K through 12 level or the college level, the vast majority of your time is sucked up with prep, right? So like creating PowerPoints, things along those lines. Tells you what materials you need. It tells you, here's how you introduce things. Ask the class about using digital devices. It's a critical skill for both personal and professional success. And it will keep going and give you like a whole breakdown. This is an activity you can do. And it will just keep going. Let's see what we got in the chat. It is kind of crazy, Daryl. No, I totally agree that it will kind of, and it's not always perfect. There are some weird things it will tell you to do, and it's not always accurate, particularly related to sources. So Dr. Martorell over the summer was teaching in the UK, and she asked ChatGPT to help her come up with an assignment to do with her students at the British Museum. And it did kind of this type of thing, and she's like, this is great. And then she looked it up, and all the exhibits it told her to go visit didn't exist. It just like made up exhibits in the museum. So you do have to check it. So yeah, slideshow or video, have you all, looks like think, pair, share type of thing. I'm gonna have it stop generating, but it will go ahead and put the whole thing out for you, right? So there's lots that you can do. It's also, a lot of it's to do with how accurate or specific the information you put in is. I don't know if anyone of you ever watches Tom Scott on YouTube. He's someone who kind of explores really fun, quirky things around the world. And he talked about, he was trying to use ChatGPT to help him code something. And like the code that it gave him wasn't working. And then he realized that like the code he initially gave ChatGPT had an error in it. So ChatGPT replicated the error, right? But let's say I wanted to say, create an essay prompt for a discussing digital literacy and how it relates to, let's say, clinical psychology. Let's make it be a little more specific. And I'm choosing clinical just because that's what my particular degree is in. Right, and so again, it'll take a minute to kind of think, but then it'll generate something for me. And if I don't like it, I can ask it to do it again. And you can also say, like, generate 3 essay prompts looking at this, and it will do that. So there are lots of really cool things you can do with this. You can use this to help you outline things. So let's say you do have a major paper to write for another class. You're like, what would be the best way to sort of do a 5-paragraph format essay or 5-section format essay about this particular topic, right? And it will help you do that. And in fact, a lot of professors are starting to encourage students to use that for that reason, because it is really helpful and helps you conceptualize things in a different way. My gosh, I never write prompts this long. Wow, there you go. Look at it go. It's still going, right? You could also do really fun stuff with it. So let's say I said, I was like, okay, we're not going to talk to college students anymore. Describe digital literacy to a 5-year-old. Right? How am I going to explain digital literacy to my kindergarten? Right, so it will change voice, and you can actually give it prompts to specifically be in a certain voice. you can tell it act as a professor or act as a copywriter. Actually, more and more people are starting to use it for proofreading, and it's actually pretty good at that apparently. The only thing that we kind of have to think about is like everything you put in, it kind of uses in the future, right? So if you put in your whole essay, is it taking your intellectual freedom out of your intellectual property? I don't know.
What's really cool is, so this is. It's like a quasi generative AI, but there are like some that actually have a voice. So like a lot of what is going on now is that they're trying to like change the generative AI to be able to like create responses fit for like who they're talking to, like if they were talking to a child, like because children are usually more expressive and excited and stuff, to like move that with equal response. And I think it's kind of weird, but also like pretty cool. So like you can see it in text, and then it's very, very quickly going from like this text to speaking.
Yeah, that's one of the things I talked about, that companies like Zoom are actually working on things like that, where you could have your camera off, but it would like generate and look like you talking, things along that line. And you know, we're using an AI right now to do the Zoom captions. Like that's its own version of an AI, right? It's not quite as generative, but it's taking what I'm saying into the computer and putting it up here, right? And again, making it into captions I can put on the YouTube video. Yeah, so there's lots of different things. There are also AI generators that are image-based, and those can be fun to kind of mess with, but also artists are having like a lot of issues related to that. Like there was an AI generated image entered into, I want to say like a photography contest, and it won, right? And so like that's scary. But here's an example of, you know, I wouldn't explain digital literacy to y'all like this, but maybe my 5-year-old would like it. It's like being really good. They even put in things like like the way you talk to a kid. Be really good at using computers and the internet. It means knowing how to play fun games on a tablet, find cool videos on a computer, even talk to friends and family on video calls. Just like you learn to read books, you also learn how to use these digital things. You could have lots of fun and learn new things too. You can also do silly things. Okay, you can tell, actually, I had to. It's like very programmed to do Snoop, because a lot of people say that. But it will kind of put on a little Snoop Dogg affectation and explain things that way, right? Or let's say I say, explain digital literacy in the voice, well, since we've been talking about them, of a CEO. How would a CEO explain digital literacy? As you can see, it takes them a minute longer. More people ask it to do Snoop because it's fun. But here we have a lot of properties that was instantly put in there, right? It's increasing digital transformation, to optimize processes, right? Like this is all very corporate speak. And so it is good like that. And then like, in essence, digital literacy is the CEO of one's personal professional development. I mean, like, I don't know if a CEO would say that, but it kind of like messes with it sometimes. Let me spell it right. A 5-minute word essay about digital literacy, including sources. Again, that's not a great prompt, so we'll see what it comes up with. And like, these look legit. Maybe they are legit. I don't know, right? You'd have to go and look and see whether these sites actually say that. It is including links for us, so that's nice. And my understanding is this is getting better at incorporating sources, so that's good. But also bad, right? In certain ways. So it's a challenge. It's something to think about. There are other, I mean, so ChatGPT is the one most people are talking about, but there are other ones. So one of the other examples that's not as good is Google Bard. And this I have, I think, through my personal Google account. So let me see. If I remember my password for that account, that'll be funny. Nope. No, I don't want to get locked out of my Google account here. Oh, it's gonna send me something, so that's good. Yes, it's me. There's some digital literacy right there. Okay. All right, so now that I'm there, I think I should be able to. It doesn't want to show me this. There we go. I think if I just open Bard now, it should let me look at it. Digital literacy. Look at me go. There we go. Can you remember your passwords? Okay. So very similar setup, as you can see. But at least the last time I played with Bard, it was not as good as ChatGPT. So let me go back to our first prompt up here. And say, make me a lesson plan. And again, it's going to take a second. And again, Bard and GPT-3 are both free. You can also access GPT-4 if you're willing to use Internet Explorer, whatever they've rebranded it as. And you can like open it in a sidebar on there for free, is my understanding. So yeah. This is actually better than what I saw before, but maybe not quite as detailed as the other one. When I did it before, it was like, it stopped here. So this is something that is developing as it gets more information and probably more feedback from users, things along those lines. And Google has been developing AI tech for years, but ChatGPT just kind of kicked them to the punch. So now they're a little bit behind the 8 ball. So that just kind of, again, gives you some ideas of what you can do with these tactics. So what do you all think are the ethics of using AI? And we talked about it in terms of like plagiarism, right? That one's pretty obvious. Either don't do it or attribute it. Like oftentimes you'll see people now, since it's new, kind of goofing, like in the Tom Scott video, he had the ChatGPT write his script. And then he said, like, ChatGPT wrote my script, right? But what are the other ethical issues with AI? What are some things that could go wrong? Or you heard stories of things going wrong? I think it might have been Michigan State, one of the universities that had a school shooting. Created a sympathy email or like a condolences email with ChatGPT and left the part at the bottom that said this was created with ChatGPT. How would you feel if you were a student on that campus and you got that? Yeah, exactly. Right? Like they couldn't take the time to write this themselves, right? Yeah, and I mentioned art in passing, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good point. We are not ready. And that's basically what we were told in these workshops is like, even though there are tools that are made to now try to detect whether people have used AI without attribution in their essays, etc. Like the AI is just going to be getting smarter than that, right? So yeah, I think that we don't know how to process it. We don't necessarily know what to do with it. But what are some ways you can imagine using it ethically, or if you have something else, Bob?
No, I have a. At least in my eyes, I find that AI can really be used to outsource a lot of this work that we're expecting to do, because a lot of people say, we just don't want AI to be for that. And I think what it really comes down to is outsourcing this work, so that humans can continue to exercise their creativity, because it's our creativity that went to be mentioned in something. So it allows for you to work something really needs the human element to it. In order to make a better press from that media, better press from the creative industry standpoint, different holidays that continue to work, and I know that they with technologies work office. We're outsourcing a like basic audio function to effectively an AI. That's going to save about 2,500 hours per 20 years.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and it's going to take that process. Yeah, that's how part of it is. So I think we learn that from the basic things. It's like, okay, where we really want with proper intelligence, and where we expect things to be.
I think that's such a good point. Yeah, and I think that's what everyone is hoping, right? And that's why the art stuff is that much more scary, because it's like, no, it's supposed to like give us time to be more creative. Yeah, the idea that there are really annoying things that all of us have to do every day, regardless if we're students, professors, workers at a corporation, that this can do for you. Apparently you can basically use AI as like a personal assistant, and you could train it to remind you about things and things along those lines.
You can do it. Like say
Oh,
when they read and did everything, so all of them actually things and get so that's like
yeah, and that is something that we've been struggling with for years. So, I'm from Detroit, both my grandfather and my father worked in the auto industry, right? And the automation of that, in some ways has been great in terms of it takes out some of the human error, right? It makes part more efficiently, but it also has meant a reduction in network costs, right? So that's always, it's like a push-pull, right? That we need to be aware of. Things like, doctors' transcription. So doctors, instead of sitting and writing their notes, will often just sort of talk them out. And for years, and this still exists, every once in a while I'll get like a thing that passed along to the psych majors. It's like, be a scribe for doctors. But like more and more of that's being taken over by AI too, right? And again, maybe it'll be more accurate, maybe it won't, depending on how good the AI is. Zoom captions have gotten much better, but they used to be kind of bad, right? But it does mean those people are now out of the job, right? And that becomes tricky to navigate. Yeah.
I think another interesting balance that there is. Or the other person that is I work most and I use like 11 different franchises. Every single one of them is really great. You know, you eventually watch and I think I'm just going to go back to how you done it and register all pieces. So you have departments that are back in place of pensions, and now that AI that is so much training. One of the 3 years robotics that are so I guess in that extent, it's for the how we appreciate AI. Even a lot of the scenarios that we which is led to a lot of people actually struggling with AI, because they may be people interactions, what's like respect, especially like in the setting, sure like the work places there, is kind of still got to work out, but also people are just on the road. I get that they would have self check out. I like that. year, I wanted to actually, it's, interesting to see how AI gets into the most cases, as I mentioned, so for that, okay, we use it to process data, and we use it to take care of student well-being, right? That's now how we use it for business science.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point about retail and, you know, things like, there was a controversy a couple of years ago. Oh, shoot, we're down to time. Dang it. Okay, we'll keep talking about this a little bit, but, just real quick, the controversy was, someone on like a Better Health type app was using AI to do therapy, didn't disclose it to people. Like, that's problematic, right? Thank you all for a great discussion. We'll keep talking about this, on Wednesday. No, today's Wednesday, on Friday.